Thanks, Simon. It's a pleasure to see you all again, even though I get tired of delivering bad news. Well, the world's political leaders are meeting today, and they're meeting under really very unusual circumstances. Summits of this kind usually involve the ratification of understandings or agreements worked out in some detail long before the leaders meet under the kind of spotlight of a summit. This time they're meeting in the midst of the worst economic conditions in 80 years globally. Not only have they not agreed to any set of responses, they and their advisors haven't come to a common view of what the problem is. Instead, much of the value of this meeting will come from President Obama and Prime Minister Brown and President Sarkozy and President Medvedev, Chancellor Merkel and President Hu, listening to each other to learn how each of them sees the crisis affecting their own countries, what they see as its causes, who or what they blame, and what they're prepared to do. Since last weekend, when German officials leaked a communique drafted by Gordon Brown calling for coordinated stimulus, leaked it in order to knock it off the table, it's been clear that the summit is unlikely to produce a coordinated response in this area, in stimulus, which is generally politically the easiest step to take. Indeed, thus far, the United States, China, and Spain are virtually the only nations in the world that have initiated significant stimulus, in part because the other major industrial countries have such extended safety nets that there's been less political pressure to stimulate. But that doesn't mean the underlying problem, isn't as great. Indeed, in some judgments, the problem in Europe may be worse than in the United States. The lack of some kind of coordinated response, even in the simple area of stimulus, is a real loss because the crisis demonstrates the extraordinary degree to which globalization has integrated the economic trajectories and fates of the world's major economies. Part of this reflects the most highly globalized sector of all, which is finance, so that the products created in New York, whether they're mortgage-backed securities and credit default swaps or normal corporate paper, are traded furiously around the world. It may well be that the European banking system incurs as much or more damage as our own. At a minimum, it's meant that the steps we've taken to bail out our own financial institutions were taken in part to protect the major institutions of our allies. This is an aspect of globalization. This was particularly clear in the early takeover of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which happened after the European governments informed the Bush administration that their own central banks were holding large quantities of Fannie and Freddie bonds. It's not this phenomenon of the way in which globalization changes and a global business cycle is not limited to finance. Under globalization, the share of everything that's traded in the world across borders, that is the share of everything that's produced in the world and then traded across borders, jumped from 18% in 1990 to 30% in 2006. 30% of everything produced everywhere in the world, goods and services, were traded across some border. The result is that a severe economic shock, like the one shaking the world today, produces the main result of protectionism, which is to say a drastic drop in global trade without new laws. It does it naturally. Compared to 1 year before, exports in January of this year were down more than 20% in the United States. They were down 30% in Germany, France, Mexico, and Britain. They were down 30 to 40% in Korea, Italy, Canada, Japan, Argentina, and here's the big one, in China. And they're down more than 40% in Russia. So we are seeing declines in global trade that we have never seen since the 1930s, coming as a natural result of a economic shock that spreads first through the financial system and then through the trading system around the world. The other early result of all of this, of course, is rising unemployment everywhere in the world. So the world finds itself in not only a systemic crisis, but a cascading one as well. That is, it's a crisis that makes itself more and more serious through feedback effects. That's the systemic part, while also spreading across sectors and countries. That's the cascading effect. In short, this is not an ordinary business cycle or an ordinary recession. And the normal steps to bring a country out of an ordinary recession aren't working. The chief response, monetary policy, is failing. We're running nearly zero interest rates today. We doubled the monetary base in 4 months. It usually takes 4 to 5 years to double the monetary base. Normally, we increase the monetary base 1 to 2% a month. In October and November, we increased it 58%. In December and January, we increased it another 50%. This is something that usually takes at least a half decade. We did it in 4 months. And the sectors that are supposed to be most sensitive to monetary policy, housing, consumer durables, and business investment, all continue to fall. We are, in the classic sense, pushing on a string with monetary policy. The fiscal stimulus will help some, though not starting in the fall and early next year, but only on a temporary basis. There are 2 fundamental reasons why this recession is so different. First, much of the core of the nation's financial sector, the whole system for distributing capital to businesses and households, can't operate normally. That's because central financial institutions are bankrupt or nearly so, or because they're trying to protect themselves against the next set of shocks. And new shocks are exactly what you have to plan for in a systemic cascading crisis. We have not seen all the stages of this crisis. There will be several more to come. Now that's the supply side. Conditions are no better on the demand side. Here, what's unique in this crisis compared to other business cycles in the lifetime of everyone in this room is that people are holding back not simply because their incomes are down or because they've lost a job or they're afraid they might lose their job soon. That's what happens in every recession. You get a reduction in consumer demand because people's incomes have gone down. What's different this time is that in addition to that, people are also suddenly and starkly poorer. Over the last year, this crisis has evaporated $14 trillion in personal wealth in America. That's split nearly evenly between the loss in value in equities and the loss in value in housing values. That's about 20% of the value of everything in the U.S. economy has been wiped out in the last year. In economic terms, the shock isn't just in the flows, that's how much income you're taking in, it's also in the stock, what you're worth, apart from your income. The result is a fast rising saving rate and fast falling consumption and fast falling business investment, which of course responds to the prospect of consumption in the future. And that's why fiscal stimulus and monetary ease aren't working, or at least they aren't enough. That's why this downturn is likely to last not the average, the 12 to 14 months, which is average for a U.S. recession, but likely about 3 years. And that's why it's so vital that we implement effective programs to address the 2 critical underlying sectors in this crisis, housing and finance. That brings us to the same conundrum facing all those leaders in London this week. What's economically necessary is very, very difficult politically. We won't stop the wealth drain until we stabilize housing. And closely related, we can't stabilize banking until we stabilize the mortgage-backed security market. That won't begin to happen until we can bring the foreclosures driving down the value of both housing and those securities back to normal levels. But how do you help those in danger of defaulting on their mortgages and facing foreclosure without igniting a political firestorm from everyone else who holds a mortgage? Who says, why are they getting help when we're not getting help? And we don't have enough money to help everybody's mortgage. So far, the administration's plan addresses the availability of mortgage refinancing. It doesn't address foreclosures, really. But banks are very unlikely to refinance a homeowner who's facing foreclosure because, by definition, they're very bad credit risks. So this approach is very unlikely to be enough. This crisis also won't abate until we can normalize the foundations of the financial system. And that can't happen so long as the system is dominated by institutions that are insolvent or very nearly so. So far, the administration's plan is to create a market for those institutions' bad assets by guaranteeing loans to private partnerships that want to buy those assets. That's a very clever way to create a market for these toxic assets. The problem is that the sick institutions that are holding these assets today have already written down the value on their books. So that unless the new buyers pay a lot more for the assets than the banks have already valued them on their own books, the plan won't make them any more solvent than they are today. This was the same problem with the Paulson plan last year. Although the Paulson plan didn't even create the market for the assets that the Obama plan does. It's not likely to be enough. So, just like the foreign leaders in London, our own leadership is still learning how this crisis is unfolding and what their options are. I'm not criticizing them for not fully understanding this yet, or not being able to take the steps yet. This is unique. We don't have any models of this. We are all trying to figure this out as we go. This process promises to be an extended one, and that means that the crisis will be a protracted one. It will take leadership of the kind not often seen to grasp the problem, accept the solutions, and then sell them to the American people. Now, extraordinary leadership is precisely what Barack Obama has promised the American people last year. Whether or not he can deliver, I think, will be the test that history will remember him for.